Every year in the United States, over 40,000 people are killed in car accidents. 40,000. And millions more are seriously injured. That amounts to more than 100 Americans killed every day. The numbers are staggering. We can never forget the human element, the human toll, the impact that accidents and tragedies have on real lives. To the individuals involved, their loved ones, and the people fighting for them, each and every one of these collisions represents one of the most horrific and challenging times in their lives. Families are left to pick up the pieces after losing loved ones. Victims are left battered and beaten down, trying to fight against a broken system with the weight of major corporations, insurance companies, or even the U.S. government pushing against them. What does recovery even look like? What does compensation look like in these cases? What's fair? And how do victims get justice in the face of seemingly insurmountable opposition? We're going to explore those questions together by examining real stories of loss, real legal battles, and real recovery here on what we're calling the True Claims Podcast. Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Johnson, and we're going to look at a very real case, a famous case here in the Pacific Northwest, one that you probably remember. We're going to look at it through some different filters, break it down a little bit so that you understand how the law works, how important it is to have good representation, and how ultimately compensation was arrived at and they settled these particular cases. I spent my career as a news anchor, and thousands of stories came across the news desk. But there are always those one story, those ones that you sit back and think about weeks, months, even years later. They linger long after the cameras have gone away. This is one of those cases. We're going to bring in Chris Davis of the Davis Law Group, who's an expert on these kinds of situations and on this particular case in just a second. But first, the nuts and bolts of what happened on this night. It was May 23rd, 2013, and in Skagit County, traffic was flowing up and down I-5, lots of traffic. 60 miles north of Seattle, the Skagit River Bridge is crossed by 70,000 vehicles every day. But on that night, at 7 p.m., traffic stopped dead. Some support beams on the bridge were hit by a large truck, and the bridge collapsed down into the rushing waters below. 2 vehicles went down with it. In one of them, a terrifying scene played out. A Navy veteran found himself separated from his unconscious wife by the collapsed roof of their truck as water began pouring into the cab of the truck. Horrifying. Despite a dislocated shoulder, among other injuries, that man was able to secure the vehicle before it could be fully submerged, and he was able somehow to bring his wife over to his side of the vehicle where they waited to be rescued. 90 minutes later, rescue teams arrived and freed them from their vehicle, and that was, in some ways, just the beginning, because now they had to try to recover from the horrifying experience. We're joined now by Chris Davis, founding attorney of the Davis Law Group. And Chris, you've been at this job for a long time, 30 years, right, as a personal injury attorney. You represented the couple in that truck after that horrifying experience. Did they find you or did you find them?
Yeah, so Dan and Sally Sly called us within a few days of that horrible day. And it was Dan that I spoke to first, and he was very, very concerned about his wife because she was still in the hospital suffering from a very serious head injury and also internal injuries. So they were pretty frantic when I first spoke to them.
You can only imagine. And again, horrifying situation. We all can sort of imagine ourselves in that situation. We ask ourselves, what would you do, right? So that was he had a dislocated shoulder, right? How did that play out?
Yeah, so he was driving along, and out of nowhere, he then feels his car start to plunge, 20, 30, 40 feet, hit the river. Water starts to pour in. Thankfully, he was a military veteran, so his instinct and training took over, and he immediately saw that his wife was unconscious, helped her out over to his side, made sure that she was breathing, while he had suffered a dislocated shoulder, while also he had suffered a concussion, was able to get them out of the cab of the vehicle onto the hood and eventually the roof of the vehicle before the car fully submerged in the river.
I can remember video of them on the roof, the hood of that vehicle, waiting for someone to come and help. I mean, just terrifying to even think about. I want to get to the bridge itself. Did she suffer a brain injury from this?
Yes, a fairly serious traumatic brain injury, along with internal injuries to her liver and pancreas as well.
Wow. We're going to start talking about the bridge itself and some of the components of this case that you took. But first, a little bit about you and the Davis Law Group. 30 years you've been in the business. Tell me about the Davis Law Group and what your goals are.
Yeah, sure. Well, let me just back out. So I was born and raised in the Puget Sound area. Grew up in Redmond, Kirkland, Bellevue. Went to high school at Lake Washington High School. Graduated from the University of Washington. Went to law school. After law school, started working for the prosecutor's office and prosecuted crimes for about a year. Then I went out on my own, and this was about 1994, 95. Tried a variety of different cases, but found myself gravitating to personal injury cases. And the thing that really attracted me to those cases is how often victims were being taken advantage of by the insurance companies. Most people, when you get in an accident or you have a claim, you have no idea what the claim is worth. And so oftentimes people will settle with the insurance company thinking that the insurance company is treating them fairly. 95% or more of the time, they're not being treated fairly. I grew up an athlete and somebody that really supports the underdog, and I really like to fight for people who are not strong enough to fight for themselves. And so when I saw how often personal injury victims were being taken advantage of, it was a natural fit for me to go in and start fighting on their behalf.
That's where you get your satisfaction from your work, is by fighting for the underdog.
Yeah, it really comes down to protecting the weaker kids from the big bully. I mean, it started. It's funny to say, but it started back in elementary school. Standing up to the big bully and not letting him, push people around. And so, of course, professionally, the bully is the insurance industry, right? What I derive the greatest meaning is doing that, and also helping people change their lives, get their lives back on track. Some of these accidents are horrible. Oftentimes it's a death in the family and everybody is devastated. And so to get them financially squared away, to get them on the path to healing so that they can put their lives back is very, very meaningful.
All right, let's get back to the Skagit River Bridge collapse. To me, an outsider, this seems like a super complicated situation. You've got infrastructure to deal with, the maintenance of the infrastructure. Was it deemed to be safe or not? The way this structure was built to begin with, the trucking companies who have their own armies of lawyers, right? You're dealing with the county and the state. I mean, where do you even start to unravel a case like this?
Yeah, it was very complicated right off the bat. The Canadian trucking company that hit the overhead truss of the bridge was a very big and powerful corporation from Canada, and they fought tooth and nail. They denied any responsibility for causing the bridge to collapse. We also had the pilot car driver and her company. We found out the pilot car driver was actually on her cell phone and not paying attention, and did not warn the truck driver behind her about the upcoming bridge and the low height of the trusses. Then the state of Washington, of course, got involved because of the damage to the bridge. I think the state ended up requesting more than $40 million, maybe $50 million in repairs to the Skagit River Bridge. There were also some other claimants, other drivers that had been injured and fallen into the river. So there were multiple claimants, multiple defendants, and complicated questions about who was at fault and why. And if there was more than one entity or one party at fault, then what percentage of fault should be assigned to the different players. With trucking companies in particular, the laws are very complicated. There are federal regulations that apply to truck drivers as well as state laws. And so the legal aspect, as far as analyzing the truck driver's responsibility, became complicated as well.
Fascinating stuff. A lot to deal with for you and the Davis Law Group. Let's talk about this specific bridge.
Right.
What was it about the makeup of this bridge that caused it to completely collapse when it was hit?
So the bridge was fairly old. I believe it had been constructed in the 1950s. And so the engineering principles or structure of the bridge did not comply with current engineering principles. And so what had happened is there was a single point failure, which means that had the bridge or the trusses been struck in a particular way, it could have caused a cataclysmic chain reaction event, which would have led to the entire bridge failing and then falling into the river. And that's exactly what we had in this particular situation. So the overhead truss that was hit led to that catastrophic failure. So the Canadian company argued very, very aggressively that the state was on notice of this fact for decades.
The state should have done something
The
about
state
it.
should have made improvements to the bridge to prevent this single point failure feature that the bridge allowed in this case, yes.
So you had this big truck, and I seem to remember that had the truck been in a different lane, the bridge might have not gone down.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. The truck driver, had he moved over to the center of the bridge span by at least 12 to 18 inches, he would have cleared the trusses and there would have been no collapse.
Chris, what is it about trucks that make them more dangerous than other vehicles?
Well, for obvious reasons, they're bigger vehicles, and so they do more damage, obviously. And the laws concerning trucks are much more complicated, and they require an attorney who has a firm mastery of those laws, because that's going to benefit the victims in a truck accident to a great extent.
So tell me about how the negotiations played out. Again, you mentioned we're talking about a Canadian trucking company,
Right.
state, and all of these. How did it play out for you?
The case involved many months of litigation, and a lot of the fighting was between the state and the Canadian company, trucking company involved. The Canadian company, the trucking company, really didn't pay much attention to my clients, weren't really concerned about the extent of their injuries. They were looking at a potential $40 to $50 million repair bill that the state was trying to enforce against them. So I was concerned during most of that litigation that my clients were not going to be taken care of, or were not going to be taken seriously by this Canadian trucking company. So we proceeded to build up the case and hire various experts to help us prove that it was the Canadian company and the pilot car driver that both of them were 100% at fault for this incident. And then we also hired many medical experts to help us prove the extent of our clients' injuries and the long-term effect that those injuries were going to have on them throughout their lives.
And you obviously came up with a number that you were looking for your clients.
Right.
Tell me what you go through when you're trying to determine that. Is it purely physical injury?
So, a lot of people think there's a formula that you apply, 2 or 3 times the medical bills, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Every case is unique. When we look at a case, we look at not only the nature and the extent of the injuries, but how those injuries affect that person, not only in the past, in the present, but also in the future. So you can have 2 people that have the same injuries, but the injury may affect them in wildly different ways, in which case you're going to have wildly different values. So the more that you can show the injuries are going to have a much more negative or long-lasting or permanent effect on a person, generally speaking, the higher the value of the claim. So with the Slies, we set out to prove that their injuries were permanent and long-lasting. I believe Mr. Sly, his injuries impacted the timeline that he had planned as far as retiring from the Navy, and that affected what his pension amount was going to be. So we hired an economist, for instance, to help us calculate what his loss in pension payments were.
These are things you don't think about when you're
Right.
reading about this case in the newspaper, right?
Yeah, most of the public does not know nearly to the extent how we go about proving a case, making it stronger so that if we have to go to trial, we're fully prepared. The medical experts are also key. So they help us quantify the nature and the extent of the injuries and how the injuries are going to affect the person and what sort of lifelong medical care the person is going to need. So we'll come up with a range and value that we think is fair. And there might be aggravating or mitigating circumstances that we may weight the range up or mitigate it down depending on the facts of each case.
So this case did not go to trial. Is that correct?
Right.
You reached a settlement.
Right.
What can you tell me about that settlement?
So all I can tell you is that the settlement is confidential, and I can tell you separately that companies that insist on confidentiality, the primary reason that they do so is because they pay a lot of money, and they don't want that to get out to the public.
Right.
So that's I'm talking separately now from the SLIs, but in general, companies will only pay large amounts if the settlement is confidential. And in the SLIs case, the Canadian company insisted that the settlement remain confidential.
Was the state off the hook in this?
The state was off the hook. And so there is a law on the books that protects the state from damage to a bridge based on the argument that the bridge did not meet current engineering standards or principles. And so the Canadian company was trying to get around that statute. I believe there's some exceptions on whether the state may have had certain notice or how egregious perhaps the standards were breached. But the Canadian company fought the state for many, many months after my client settled, and eventually appealed the loss all the way to, I think, the Supreme Court.
Wow.
and lost at the appellate level.
Wow. How about that? Fascinating. What are the takeaways from this situation? Obviously, this is a worst case scenario. We hope that none of us are ever in a situation like this, but it happens.
Right.
These tragedies happen. What were your takeaways from handling this case?
Well, first of all, in a case like this, especially involving wealthy, sophisticated defendants like trucking companies or like the government, it's really important that people hire an attorney right away. Because the trucking companies and the government are usually defending the case on day one. They've got lawyers and experts and engineers that show up on the scene of the collision to start damage control, right? Oftentimes victims don't hire their own attorney until months or even sometimes years later. That really puts them at a disadvantage. So that's number one. Number two, this case involved a wealthy trucking company. And in general, trucking companies are very, very aggressive when it comes to defending accidents that they cause. Almost always the trucking company will call a lawyer or a trucking expert to actually go to the scene of the accident nearly in close in time to when that accident occurs. And again, to start damage control, to collect evidence. We've had cases sometimes where they lose or destroy important evidence that they collect at the scene to their advantage. So again, with trucking companies in particular, people really need to hire counsel right away so that their interests are being protected from day one.
All right, Chris. Absolutely fascinating to me as someone who's just from the outside looking in at a case like this. We reported this on the news a lot, of course, for months, but to hear that inside story on how this played out is really fascinating. That's going to wrap up our very first episode of the True Claims podcast. I hope you learned something. I know I did. We'll be back again and do it again for you. For Chris Davis from the Davis Law Group, I'm Eric Johnson. We'll see you later. Eric Johnson here. I spent the last 30 years reporting on what you need to know, and now I've got something I think everyone could use. The Washington Accident Book Series offers a free legal guidebook on everything from car crashes to dog bites, so that you know what to expect after any kind of accident. Know your rights and how to avoid common mistakes after an accident by getting your free copy at WashingtonAccidentBooks.com.